Hello and welcome to this recording in which we will be looking at how to calculate the under and over absorption of overheads. As discussed, overhead absorption rates are calculated based on budgeted figures. So the overhead absorption rate is calculated by dividing the budgeted overhead by the budgeted level of activity, and that could be machine hours or labour hours. Those are the most common two. We then use that OAR to absorb or add an amount of overheads to the prime cost in order to have a total cost figure for our product, to which we can then add a required profit to give us a selling price. So we have the prime cost, we add the overhead absorbed, and we've worked that out by using the overhead absorption rate multiplied by the activity. So if the overhead absorption rate is labour hours, then we multiply it by the labour hours. And that gives us the total cost. We can then look at the profit required, and we have a selling price. Because we need that selling price before we produce our products, because we need to be able to quote our customers, that was why we use an overhead absorption rate based on budgeted figures. But what this does mean is that the overhead absorbed may not be accurate. So the figure that we have added to our prime cost to cover the overheads may be lower or higher than our actual overheads. When we eventually receive invoices, we will be able to see what our actual overheads are for a period. And what we can then do is compare that actual overhead figure to the total overheads absorbed in the period, and we can determine whether we have under absorbed or over absorbed. If we have over absorbed, that means that we have added a greater amount to cover overheads than we are actually going to pay according to the invoices. If we've under absorbed, it means that the invoices that we've received for our actual overheads are more than the amount we have added or absorbed to cover our overheads. Now this can have an effect on our expected profits. If we had calculated the profit that we expected based on our overheads absorbed, and we then discover that we've actually over absorbed, it means that our actual profit will be higher than we expected it to be. If we've under absorbed, it means that we have not added enough overheads to our prime cost to cover our actual overheads according to the invoices. And so that means that our actual profit is going to be less than we expected it to be. The general causes of under or over absorption are due to a difference in the actual activity and the budgeted figures. So our overhead absorption rate calculated using a budgeted overhead figure. If the actual overheads differ to the budgeted overheads, then there will be an under or over absorption. Similarly, we've used a budgeted level of activity. If the actual level of activity differs to the budgeted level, again, that will lead to an under or over absorption. So you need to be able to calculate under or over absorptions. The first thing that you need to make sure that you can do is to calculate the amount of overhead absorbed. So this is using your overhead absorption rate, which is always calculated on budgeted figures, and then multiplying that by the actual activity. That gives you the overhead absorbed, or the overhead that you are going to add to your prime cost. You then compare your overhead absorbed to your actual overheads and calculate any under or over absorption. So we'll have a look at an example. So here we have a company using an overhead absorption rate of £2.50 per machine hour in the machining department, and then there's another department where they've got an overhead absorption rate of £1.60 per labour hour, and that's in the assembly department. We're told that the actual overheads amounted to £15,000 in the machining department and £12,000 in the assembly department. And then we have some further information in relation to hours worked. And we're required to calculate the under or over absorption within each department. So we'll start with machining. So firstly, we need to know the overhead absorbed. That is the overhead absorption rate times actual activity. So for machining, we know the overhead absorption rate is £2.50 per machine hour. So we multiply that by the actual activity. So that's the actual machine hours, which we're told is £6,400. So that means we have absorbed a total of £16,000. So that's what we've added to our prime cost to cover the cost of the overheads. So now we need to know, was that enough or was it too much? The actual overheads for the machining department were £15,000. The actual overheads were £15,000. So we've actually over absorbed. We've added £16,000 to the material and labour costs to cover overheads, but when the invoices came in, they were only for £15,000. So we've added £1,000 more than we needed to. So we've over absorbed by £1,000. Now let's look at assembly. So we take the overhead absorption rate, which is £1.60 per labour hour. Remember, that would have been calculated on budgeted figures. And we multiply that by the actual number of labour hours worked. So in assembly, actual labour hours, 7,200. That tells us that we've absorbed £11,520. How does that compare to the actual overheads that we were invoiced for this department? We're told that the actual overheads were £12,000 in the assembly department. So in this instance, we have under absorbed. We've only added £11,520 in total to cover our overheads in this period of time. But when the invoices came in, we're going to have to pay £12,000. So we've under absorbed by £480. So there will be under and over absorptions due to the fact that your overhead absorption rates are based on budgeted figures. But you have no choice but to calculate them based on budgeted figures, because you need these overhead absorption rates in order to work out the cost of your product before you produce it, so that you can give quotes to your customers, so that you can set selling prices for your customers. So just to recap, the overhead absorption rate always calculated using budgeted figures. To work out the amount of overhead absorbed, you multiply that overhead absorption rate by the actual activity, and then to calculate the amount of under or over absorption, you compare the overhead absorbed to the actual overhead. And that brings us to the end of this recording.